What does it feel like in the final seconds before agony consumes you? In the narrow, airless chamber, the light is not daylight, but a trembling flame, trapped within the curved glass of a single oil lamp. Its glow quivers against the damp stone. Walls bending shadows into grotesque shapes that sway and lurch like silent witnesses. The floor beneath is uneven, centuries worn, and still holds the chill of the earth. A smell hangs in the air, sharp, metallic, and faintly sweet, the way iron smells when it has been left in the rain. But tonight it is joined by something else, something heavier, on a rough-hewn table. Its surface blackened and blistered from long use. A small copper pot sits above a brazier. The fire beneath is angry and restless, snapping in the quiet like the whisper of an impatient tongue. Within the pot, the oil is alive, its surface rippling as bubbles rise and burst, releasing brief hisses of steam. Each hiss seems to mark the passage of time, an unhurried countdown to whatever will happen next. The patient's chair is not a chair at all, but a frame of thick oak, reinforced with leather straps. These straps are not decorative. They are meant to hold, to bind, to make certain there is no escape. Tonight, the wood creaks under the weight of a man whose body is tense with terror, every muscle drawn tight in anticipation of the unknown. He is not dressed for comfort, but in the thin remnants of a servant's tunic, torn near the shoulder where hurried hands have stripped cloth. Away. His breath is quick, sharp, shallow. His eyes dart to the door, to the stone ceiling, to the dark recess of the room's corner, anywhere but toward the copper pot. The physician stands opposite him, tall, broad-shouldered, the sort of man whose presence would fill a room even without the smell of boiling. Oil at his side, his hair, streaked with iron grey, falls forward as he leans over his work. In his right hand he holds a long, slender instrument, a hollow needle of hammered silver, cold now, but soon to be warm. In his left, a cloth damp from something poured over it earlier, perhaps to cleanse, perhaps to numb, perhaps merely to pretend. He speaks little when he does. It is not to the man in the chair, but to himself, small mutterings, reciting the steps he has read so many times in parchment-bound books from older centuries. His tone is steady, almost prayer-like. To him, this is not cruelty, it is necessity. The servant's lips part. His voice emerges in fragments, dry from fear. Please, but the word dissolves before it reaches its full shape, smothered by the weight of the room. A second man steps forward, an assistant. Younger, eyes darting as if unsure whether to meet the patient's gaze. He checks the straps, pulling each leather band until it bites into the flesh beneath. The patient jerks at the sudden pressure, a small grunt escaping him. The assistant looks away quickly. From the corner of the chamber comes a sound, a faint pop. The oil in the pot has begun to spit, small flecks leaping up before sinking back into the swirling gold. The physician lifts the pot's handle with a cloth-wrapped hand, tilting it slightly, watching the slow dance of heat within. He does not rush. He cannot rush. The servant's head presses back against the chair, his jaw clenched so tightly that a vein begins to show along his temple. The smell of the oil grows stronger now, almost choking, mixing with the acrid scent of the brazier's smoke. Somewhere, deep in the stone walls, a drop of water falls. The sound is tiny, but in this room, it might as well be a bell tolling for the dead. Without warning, the physician steps forward. His shadow, thrown large and wavering against the far wall, seems almost to reach before him. He dips the tip of the silver needle into the pot. The oil clings to the metal, shimmering, holding fast in the instant before it begins to slide downward in a slow, deliberate drip. The assistant steadies the patient's head. His fingers are cold. The servant's eyes widen, searching, pleading for something, mercy, explanation, even a lie, to soften what is coming. None comes. The first touch is not gentle. The needle pierces flesh, and with it, the boiling oil finds its way into a place no living thing was meant to feel such heat. The scream is immediate and total, raw enough to seem pulled from the deepest part of the body. It reverberates off the stones, rising and breaking like waves against an unyielding shore. The straps strain under the man's convulsions, but they hold. The physician's face does not twist in satisfaction or cruelty. Instead, his eyes are fixed in concentration, as if every ounce of his being is bent toward the precision of this moment. He believes, truly believes, that pain is the path to cleansing, that fire can drive out the body's cold humors, that suffering can be turned into salvation. But belief does not soften the scream. Seconds stretch. The air thickens. The assistant's lips are pressed into a tight line, his breathing shallow, as though he too might be trapped in the leather straps. The oil's scent fills the lungs, settles into the hair, clings to the skin. It will not wash out easily. At last, the needle is withdrawn. A small wisp of steam rises from the wound, a cruel parody of healing warmth. The physician sets the instrument aside, careful, deliberate, as though the precision of his motions might justify the horror just committed. The servant's head hangs forward now, chin resting on his chest. His breath comes in ragged bursts. In the stillness that follows, the only sound is the oil, still bubbling faintly in its pot, as if impatient for the next step. Somewhere beyond the door, the world continues. Boots scuff against flagstones. Distant voices murmur about supper, about weather, about matters that have nothing to do with the hell in this room. The chamber remains apart, a sealed world where time is measured not in hours, but in the slow drip of oil and the fading strength of a man's cries. The physician steps back into the shadow, wiping his hands with the same calm precision with which he began. The firelight catches his eyes, not bright with triumph, nor dimmed with regret, simply steady, waiting, and in that pause, in that silence between breaths, the story retreats into darkness, leaving only the question hanging in the still air. What strange path of thought could lead a man here to believe that healing begins with fire? What is the value of a cure that kills as surely as the disease? In the long centuries we call the Middle Ages, illness was not a puzzle to be solved, but a darkness to be driven out by any means the healer's mind could conjure. There was no microscope to reveal the hidden world of infection, no understanding of bacteria or nerve endings, only the ancient conviction that the body was ruled by four invisible fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This humoral theory, born in the schools of Greece and Rome, was the guiding scripture of medicine for over 1,000 years. Every malady, from a fever to paralysis, was explained as an imbalance between these humors. Too much heat in the body, bleed it out. Too much cold, burn it away. To the medieval physician, the flesh was a furnace whose fires could be stoked or smothered at will if only one knew which element to call upon. And so the sick were leeched, cut, blistered, purged, or roasted in desperate hope. The healers' tools were as simple as they were cruel: sharp knives honed on whetstones, cups of hot iron pressed to the skin, hooks for lifting the flesh to let the bad humors flow. A poultice might be made of herbs, yes, but also of ground worms, crushed beetles, or the ash of burnt animal bones, each chosen for the strange properties ascribed to them by tradition. There was beauty in the language, and horror in the practiced. Our religion was no distant observer in these chambers of pain. The Church, seeing sickness as both punishment and test, taught that disease could cleanse the soul as fire tempers iron. Some physicians were monks, men whose days began with prayers and ended with bleeding a patient until the floor darkened beneath them. Others were secular, yet still bound to the same superstitions that certain herbs must be gathered under a waning moon, that demons could lodge in the body and be smoked out with burning resin, that fevers might be tamed by swallowing the crushed heart of a bird. In this world, suffering was not an unintended side effect. It was proof that the treatment was working. The patient who writhed and screamed was, in the physician's mind, showing that the poison was being drawn out, that the balance was being restored. If they died under the treatment, it was because the illness had been too strong, not because the cure was worse. To modern eyes, it is easy to name this barbarism. But the men who wielded the lancet and the brazier believed they were heirs to an ancient wisdom. Their libraries held translations of Galen and Hippocrates. Bound in leather, their margins crowded with notes from scholars long dead. In the dim candlelight of their studies, they traced diagrams of the human body, not from dissection, which the Church often forbade, but from inherited texts, where the liver was the seat of courage and the spleen the source of melancholy. These physicians dressed like scholars, heavy robes in winter, lighter gowns in summer, a chain or ring to mark their station. They moved among the nobility with a quiet confidence, called upon in moments when wealth itself could not bribe away death. Their patients saw them as learned men, their hands touched by both God and knowledge. The truth was that their wisdom was ancient, but their cures were often little more than refined torture. The philosophy of opposites governed every act. A man with chills and pale skin was deemed cold and wet. He must be treated with hot and dry remedies. This could mean blistering the skin with heated metal, or forcing him to drink wine spiced with pepper and mustard until his stomach rebelled. For one thought to be hot and dry, perhaps fevered, flushed, the treatment could be leeching, or the application of ice-cold cloths, steeped in vinegar. Sometimes the measures were theatrical, almost ritualistic. A patient might be seated before a brazier, while a physician swung censers of smoking herbs around his body, chanting fragments of Latin, his voice low and steady like a priest at the altar. Another might be placed in a bath of scalding water, the steam wrapping around his head until he could barely breathe. And if the sickness lingered, the physician would turn to stronger measures, oil, heated until it danced and bubbled, ready to burn the illness out. Behind these acts lay a conviction that nature herself was dangerous, that she hid poisons in the air, in stagnant water, in the body's own secret workings. To heal was to fight her, to seize control before she rotted. The patient from within. Pain was the weapon. The healer was the general. The patient was the battlefield. It is tempting to imagine these men as sadists, hiding their cruelty behind a scholar's mask. Some may have been. There are accounts of physicians who lingered over their work with unsettling patients, who seemed to relish the cries of their patients, but many more believed themselves righteous, servants of both science and God, charged with the grim duty of hurting in order to heal. They would not have understood our horror at their methods. To them, restraint in the face of illness would have been the real cruelty, and yet There were moments, brief, fragile, when doubt may have crept in. A patient dead too soon, a scream that echoed long after the work was done. A look in the eyes of a loved one watching from the shadows. These moments seldom made it into the written record, but one imagines they lived on in the quieter corners of the healer's mind. In the city streets, beyond the sick room, life continued with its own brutal rhythm, merchants hawking wares, the ring of a blacksmith's hammer, the cries of children. But somewhere, in a darkened chamber behind shuttered windows, the fight against sickness went on, with tools of heat and blade, with rituals older than the kingdom itself. To step into such a room was to enter a place where the line between care and cruelty blurred until it vanished entirely. And in one such chamber, on one such night, the theories of the ancients and the confidence of a learned man would meet the body of a servant in a way that would be remembered not for its healing, but for its horror. What becomes of a man when his body breaks and the world decides he is no longer worth the trouble of saving? He had no title, no estate, no voice in the councils of the realm. His name, whispered in the kitchens of the noble house he served, was Tomas. To his master, he was a shadow, a man who moved through corridors unnoticed, who kept fires burning in the winter and the floors swept in the summer, who could be trusted to vanish before his presence was ever inconvenient. In the hierarchy of medieval life, he was neither peasant nor freeman in the fullest sense. He was a servant bound not by chains, but by the slow gravity of obligation. Before the fall, he had been quick on his feet, agile in the way of men who must make themselves useful before being ordered to do so. In the early mornings, when the frost still clung to the stable doors, he would bring water for the horses, his breath hanging in the air like a ghost. He had a quiet humor that showed itself only in the company of the other servants, a rare gift in a house where laughter was rationed. Those who knew him well spoke of his patience, his willingness to carry burdens without complaint, his habit of humming old harvest songs as he worked. Then, one afternoon, his life was reduced to a single, unalterable moment. It happened in the courtyard, where the flagstones were slick with rain. A cart, heavy with barrels of wine, had been left too close to the stable archway. Tomas, hurrying to move it before the master's return, lost his footing. The wheel slipped from the rut, the weight shifted, and he was thrown backward. His spine met the unyielding stone with a sound that silenced the courtyard. The barrels rolled harmlessly aside. The man did not rise at first. There was hope that the numbness in his legs was only the shock of the fall, that a night's rest might restore what had been taken. But morning brought no change, neither did the next. Physicians were summoned, not out of any great compassion for the man, but because an injured servant could be a liability, a disruption in the smooth machinery of the household. They examined him with brisk detachment, asking him to lift his legs, to stand, to walk. When he could do none of these, they exchanged looks that spoke of finality. A broken back was not an injury they could mend, one by one. They withdrew their interest. There was no profit in wasting their time on a man whose labor could no longer be sold, no glory in curing a servant when noble blood waited in other chambers. Some advised letting him rest until nature decided his fate. Others suggested a quiet removal to the almshouse. A few, with the cruelty that comes from indifference, recommended putting him out of his misery. But Tomas lingered. His master, unwilling to feed a man who could no longer work, relegated him to a small room near the kitchen, where the smoke from the hearth curled under the door and the air was always warm. He was given food, though less than before, and visited, occasionally by the scullery maid who brought him news of the house. She noticed how he kept his hands busy, even when his legs lay useless beneath him, mending torn cloth, polishing brass, anything that might make him feel less of a burden. It was in these months of waiting that his fate drew the attention of the man who would become his physician, not out of charity, but curiosity. For the learned doctor, Tomas was not a patient in the ordinary sense. He was a problem to be solved, an inert body on which to test theories that had no willing subjects. The other physicians had pronounced his case hopeless. This made him valuable in a different way. If the doctor succeeded, he would be celebrated. If he failed, the world would shrug. After all, the man was already broken. There is a certain danger in being deemed beyond saving. It strips away the protections afforded to the healthy, the valuable, the visible. In the dim corridors of the great house, Tomas became an object of discussion, not of empathy. His injury was a curiosity, his life a resource to be used. He was no longer a man who had once hummed while carrying water for the horses. He was a spine to be prodded, a set of muscles to be tested, a vessel for the most desperate kind of experimentation. He agreed to the treatment, though it is unlikely he understood fully what it meant. In the language of the time, the physician spoke of balancing humors, of drawing heat into the cold parts of the body, of restoring the natural flow. To Tomas, these words may have sounded like hope. When you have nothing left but pain and immobility, even the faintest promise of change can feel like a gift. And so he waited for the day when the doctor would arrive with his instruments, his assistants, and the strange-smelling substances he carried in stoppered jars. Outside his small room, the rhythms of the household went on unchanged. Servants scurried to prepare meals, boots clicked across stone floors, and the laughter of guests echoed in the high halls. Inside, Tomas lay in the half-light, listening to the sounds of life moving past him, knowing that whatever happened next would happen to him alone. There is a quiet cruelty in being forgotten while still alive. The world did not mourn him, for he was not yet dead, nor did it celebrate him, for he could no longer serve. He existed in a narrow space between usefulness and oblivion, and in that space the boundaries of what could be done to him began to dissolve. When the summons finally came, it was without ceremony. 2 men entered his room, lifted him without asking, and carried him down the corridor toward a chamber he had never seen before. The air grew cooler as they descended, the scent of damp stone replacing the warmth of the kitchen hearth. Somewhere below he could hear the faint, irregular hiss of liquid meeting heat. Tomas did not yet know the shape of the pain that awaited him. He knew only that he was being taken to a place where men like him rarely returned the same, if they returned at all. There are men who heal to save lives, and there are men who heal to save themselves. In the city where he first made his name, the physician was spoken of in hushed tones, as if he belonged to a breed apart. He had studied at the finest universities of Christendom, halls where Latin prayers mingled with the scratch of quills, where young men memorized the words of Galen as if they were scripture. The parchment records list his lectures attended, his degrees obtained, his disputations defended with fervor. In every note, his mind appears sharp, disciplined, precise. Yet those same records do not capture the glint in his eye when he spoke of diseases others dared not treat, nor the way his hand would linger over diagrams of the body's hidden channels, its unseen fires. Born to a modest merchant family, he had clawed his way upward with a kind of intellectual ferocity. His father had traded in spices, cinnamon, pepper, and the resinous lumps of frankincense that smelled of both church and distant lands. As a boy, he had watched these goods arrive by ship, had seen men haggle over their price, and learned early that value often lay in rarity. Perhaps this was why he sought out ailments no other man could cure. They were rare and therefore precious to him. By the time he arrived at the royal court, he had already cultivated a reputation for daring. He did not shy away from cases considered hopeless. Indeed, he preferred them. His treatments were unconventional, his reasoning a blend of established theory and private conviction. While others clung to the safety of repetition, he courted the dangerous allure of the unknown. To some, he was a genius. To others, a gambler in physician's robes. What drew him most was heat. Not the heat of fever that was a thing to be moderated, but the deliberate application of fire, flame, and scalding liquid to drive out illness. In his lectures, he spoke of the body as a furnace, its health dependent on the proper balance of hot and cold. A limb gone cold after injury, he argued, could be awakened by a shock of burning oil. A paralysis of the spine could be reversed by summoning heat deep into the marrow. There were whispers that he had once boiled instruments in scented wine before pressing them against a man's skull to treat madness, that he had wrapped fevered children in steaming cloths until their skin flushed crimson dot at court, where survival depended on more than medicine. He learned the art of spectacle. He dressed in rich fabrics, his sleeves lined with fur in winter, his cuffs scented faintly with the same imported spices his father once sold. He spoke with eloquence, his voice low, persuasive, capable of holding a room in stillness. In the great halls, amid the flicker of candlelight, he wove stories of ancient cures, citing cases from Alexandria and Constantinople, as if he had witnessed them himself. The nobles listened, half convinced, half enchanted. They valued his confidence, for confidence, in those times, was the currency of healing. Yet behind this carefully constructed image lay the shadow of frustration. His private letters, preserved in brittle ink, betrayed the mind of a man whose ambition gnawed at him. He railed against colleagues who called him reckless, condemned their timidity, accused them of clinging to methods that yielded no miracles. In one, he writes of a paralysis that mocks the hands of lesser men and his certainty that the cure lies in fire, as Prometheus gave to man to awaken the dead limbs. Another letter hints at despair. The court will remember me only if I succeed where others have failed. I cannot bear to leave no mark. Gossip spread easily in the royal city. Servants whispered of his temper, how he would slam doors in the infirmary when a patient worsened. Some claimed to have heard him muttering to himself, pacing by candlelight, rehearsing arguments for treatments no one had sanctioned. Others spoke of a locked cabinet in his chamber, filled with strange oils in glass vials, powders whose origins were unknown, and instruments with tips blackened by heat. His apprentices obeyed him without question, though they often avoided his gaze when he worked, as if fearing they might glimpse the raw intensity that drove him. It was this volatility, half brilliance, half desperation, that made him dangerous. He was not content to be one of many physicians, drifting through the court, attending to coughs and fevers. He sought a case that would secure his place in history. And when the crippled servant was placed before him, a man cast aside by others, he saw not a life in pain, but an opportunity. Here was the incurable he had long imagined, a body to test the full force of his theories, one in which failure could be excused, but success would be immortal. In his mind, the logic was unassailable. If coldness had taken the man's lower body, then fire must drive it out. The application could not be timid. It must be deep, invasive, impossible for the body to ignore. To others, the idea would have sounded perilous, even cruel. To him, it was an elegant equation, greater heat for greater healing. In this conviction, he found a strange kind of serenity. But serenity was not the same as mercy. The physician's notebooks from this period are meticulous in their technical detail, yet devoid of human observation. They record the stiffness of joints, the pallor of skin, the absence of reflex, but never the tone of the patient's voice, the way his eyes followed movement, the fatigue in his breathing. The man was a problem to be solved, nothing more. In this, the doctor's brilliance narrowed into something colder, harder, the belief that the ends justified whatever means the cure demanded. The royal court, for all its gossip, cared little for what was done to a servant in some distant chamber. The physician knew this. He knew that should the experiment succeed, he would be praised for his daring. Should it fail, the failure would be buried with the patient's obscurity. This knowledge did not trouble him. It emboldened him. In the final weeks before the procedure, he prepared with the same intensity a knight might bring to battle. Oils were selected for their heat-retaining properties, their viscosity under flame. Instruments were refined, their edges and curves adjusted to his exact design. Assistants were instructed on their roles, their movements rehearsed until they could perform them without hesitation. And through it all, he moved with the calm certainty of a man who had convinced himself that destiny was on his side. When the day came, he greeted his patient not with warmth, but with measured politeness, as one might greet a witness to a great work. In his eyes, the crippled servant was already part of history, a figure in the first line of a story he had waited his entire life to write. And so the doctor's mind, alight with visions of fire, turned from preparation to action, setting the stage for a treatment whose cruelty would burn itself into memory. It is a strange thing to stand in a palace and feel the air heavy with both perfume and fear. The royal court was a world of brilliance and decay, a place where men and women adorned themselves in silks and jewels, even as their bodies betrayed them in quiet, humiliating ways. Behind the glint of candlelight on gilded ceilings lay an unspoken truth. Illness had no respect for rank. The most powerful duke could be brought low by a fever in the night. The most envied beauty could wake to find her skin marred by the bloom of some unknown rash. Disease was the one guest who moved freely through the palace, unannounced and unstoppable. In such a world, medicine was not merely a craft, it was theatre. A physician's worth was measured not by the steady hand that preserved life in obscurity, but by the miracles he could perform under the watchful eyes of those who could end his career with a whisper. The court did not crave moderation. It craved spectacle. A nobleman's recovery was to be paraded, his suffering transformed into a story of triumph, his healer elevated as a figure touched by providence. Failure, too, became theatre, but of a crueler kind, a slow withdrawal of invitations. The turning of heads, the physician's name passed between lips in tones of disappointment or disdain. The doctor, ambitious and already marked as a man of daring, found in this atmosphere both his greatest opportunity and his gravest peril. His patronage came from a handful of influential figures, each of them less interested in the safety of their physician's methods than the glory those methods might bring. One had a brother wasting away from a wasting illness, another a mistress whose beauty was slipping, her cheeks hollowing with each passing month. To them, The doctor was not a healer so much as a weapon, a means to defy the humiliations of nature, if only for a while. Court politics turned the physician's chambers into an arena. Rivalries played out not just in council halls, but in the sick rooms of the palace. A noble who secured the doctor's attention could flaunt it as a token of influence, just as he might flaunt a rare diamond or a falcon from the east. A rival might undermine that prestige with rumors that the doctor's methods were dangerous, that his success owed more to luck than skill. In this way, every cure became a move in a larger game, every failure an opening for an enemy. The stakes made subtlety a liability. To win favor, a cure had to astonish, and to astonish, it often had to be extreme. The doctor's fascination with heat therapies, once an eccentricity tolerated in academic halls, became in this climate a selling point. Nobles spoke of his work as one might speak of a daring siege or a risky voyage, the kind of endeavor that, if it succeeded, would be remembered for years. Upstairs, in the great banquet halls, the court laughed and drank beneath chandeliers of crystal, the air thick with the scent of roasted game and imported wines. Downstairs, in shadowed corridors, the talk was different. Servants whispered of who had taken ill, who had summoned the doctor in the night, and who had failed to reappear at table the next day. The palace had its own geography of sickness, certain wings avoided, certain chambers thought to carry misfortune, staircases that led not to salons, but to rooms where patients lay in silence. The physician moved between these worlds, at home in neither but dependent on both. He dined in the glittering halls, nodding politely to those who praised his skill, and descended later into the dim, airless quarters where his patients waited. There, the walls were bare, the floors unpolished, the air heavy with the smell of damp linen and old sweat. The same hands that accepted jeweled goblets at the high table now pressed against fevered skin. Yet in both places he was watched upstairs by those hungry for a performance, downstairs by those desperate for relief. The court's hunger for public miracles shaped his every decision. A slow recovery that left a patient alive but unimpressive was worth less than a sudden, dramatic transformation, even if it carried risk. This expectation narrowed his choices, pushing him toward methods that promised speed, even at the cost of safety. The unspoken bargain was simple. If the patient lived, he would be celebrated. If the patient died, he would be forgotten, provided. The death was quiet, and in the quiet spaces of the palace, death was common, too common. Consumption, pox, fevers of unknown origin each claimed their victims without regard for the embroideries on their clothes. But to acknowledge this too openly was dangerous. The court preferred to believe in its own immunity, that the walls of the palace and the favor of God would hold illness at bay. It was a comforting fiction, and the physician's role was to uphold it at all costs. Thus the doctor's work became part of the palace's grand illusion. His treatments were less about the private reality of healing than about the public appearance of control. If he could make a man walk who had not walked, if he could return color to a woman's cheeks before a feast, he proved that even in a world ruled by decay, human will could prevail, at least for a night. But such illusions demand their sacrifices. Every triumph heightened expectation, every daring cure invited the next. And somewhere in the depths of the palace, in a narrow room where the walls sweated with damp and the only light came from a single flickering lamp, the crippled servant waited, unaware that he had been chosen not for his life's worth, but for his potential to serve as a miracle in the making. The doctor, meanwhile, moved through the halls with the confidence of a man who had learned the court's true law, that glory and ruin were separated only by the thinnest veil, and that those who walked that edge were the ones remembered longest. It was under this shadow, half splendor, half rot, that the physician prepared for his most dangerous demonstration yet. They called it a cure. But cures can kill as surely as any poison. The decision was not made in haste. It was the slow crystallization of an idea, distilled over years of study, failure, and longing for triumph. In the physician's mind, the servant's crippled state was not merely a misfortune. It was an affront to order, an insult to the principles of restoration that the ancients had sworn were possible. In Galen's surviving treatises, in the marginalia of Paracelsus, and in the fevered debates of scholars long dead, he had read of fire's purifying virtue, that heat, when applied with precision, could dissolve obstruction, stimulate dormant flesh, and drive away the cold humours that rendered limbs lifeless. But ordinary warmth would not suffice. To awaken deadened nerves, he reasoned, the stimulus must be extreme, a controlled violence that would scourge the malady from the body. Oil, heated beyond endurance, was the chosen instrument. In ancient temples, oil had anointed kings and corpses alike. It was a substance of sanctity and transformation. Here it would serve as the alchemical bridge between ruin and renewal. The logic was perilous, yet within the physician's mind, it was not cruelty, it was necessity. Preparation for the procedure unfolded like a ritual. The chamber chosen was small and unadorned, its single window shuttered against the winter sun. The stone floor was bare, save for a single rug to catch the inevitable spill. A brazier was set in the corner, its iron bowl already glowing with coals. Above it hung a copper vessel filled with oil, the surface quivering as it began to seethe. The smell was sharp and acrid, a mingling of metal, smoke, and something faintly sweet, a deceptive scent that masked its lethality. The patient was brought in under the watch of 2 attendants. His body, once quick and strong in the service of a young nobleman, now moved with an awkward fragility. His right leg dragged against the floor, the foot twisted inward from the fall that had shattered him. His hands, calloused from years of work, gripped the arm of the chair into which they lowered him. He did not plead. Perhaps he trusted the physician's promise of movement restored. Perhaps resignation had already claimed him. The physician moved with deliberate calm. His tools were simple: a funnel of hammered tin, strips of linen to bind the limb, a basin of water for cooling. He inspected the leg with clinical detachment, tracing the wasted muscles with his fingertips, noting where the skin was cold to the touch. He spoke little, offering only a few murmured reassurances in the tone of one speaking to himself as much as to the patient. From the brazier came the first audible pop of oil breaking the surface. The physician glanced toward it, gauging the temperature by sight alone. To cool, and the treatment would fail. Too hot, and the tissue would char before the heat could work its supposed magic. He waited until the thin wisp of vapor curling upward became a steady thread. The attendants secured the patient's leg, wrapping the upper thigh tightly to limit the spread of the heat's damage. The skin there paled under the pressure of the binding. The servant's breathing quickened. Somewhere beyond the shuttered window, a bell tolled the hour, each strike a reminder that what was about to happen would be irrevocable. The physician lifted the copper vessel from the brazier with thick cloths wrapped around his hands. He did not hesitate. Hesitation was the province of doubt, and doubt was the enemy of discovery. The funnel was placed over a small incision near the knee, made moments earlier with a scalpel edge honed to a whisper. The oil's surface trembled as it reached the lip. The first contact was met with a sound no human voice should make a cry so sharp it seemed to split the air itself. The oil rushed into the wound, a gleaming torrent that hissed against living flesh. The smell changed instantly, sweet turning to bitter, like roasted grain left too long in the fire. The patient's body convulsed, straining against the attendant's grip, his hands clawing at the air as if to find some anchor outside. His own skin, the physician's face, was not one of sadism. His eyes were fixed, unblinking, on the limb, watching for signs, a twitch that might signal awakening nerves, a flush of color to prove that the dead tissue was drinking in the heat like dry earth drinks rain. He did not speak, did not comfort. Every breath, every thought was given to the observation of his theory in motion. The oil's heat diminished quickly. Another ladle was fetched, and again it was poured, slower this time, as though tempering steel. The patient's screams broke into ragged sobs, then into a hoarse, animal sound, neither word nor plea, only the raw voice of pain. The attendants exchanged glances over his bowed head, but their hands did not loosen. When the final measure was poured, the physician stepped back, sweat standing on his brow despite the chill of the room. He ordered the wound packed with linen, soaked in cool water, the bandages wrapped tight to contain the heat within. His voice was calm, as if dictating a letter. He noted the color of the skin, the steadiness of the pulse, the cessation of violent thrashing once the limb was immobilized. To him, these were data points, not the aftermath of agony. The patient sagged in the chair, his chest rising in shallow bursts. His eyes, glassy with tears and shock, did not find the physician's face, but fixed instead on the shuttered window, as though the light beyond it might be the last thing worth remembering. For the doctor, the moment was not one of horror, but of anticipation. The theories of centuries, the hopes of his own restless ambition, had been poured, quite literally, into this man's flesh. Whether the act would be remembered as a miracle or condemned as madness was no longer in his hands. All that remained was to wait, and in that waiting, the palace seemed to hold its breath. What does the body become when hope has burned through it? The chamber where the procedure had taken place now smelled of damp cloth and the faint, metallic tang of blood. The oil had cooled, but its work or its ruin had only just begun. In the hours following the operation, the servant's leg had swollen grotesquely, the skin drawn taut and shining as though it might split. The color, once merely flushed, deepened to a mottled crimson and black, a sick map of heat's dominion over flesh. The physician had expected pain. He had even accounted for swelling. These were, in his mind, natural signs that the body was rallying to his intervention, that the fire he had poured inside the man was waking the dormant life within. But by the following morning, the servant's foot hung cold and unresponsive, the toes curling inward as if recoiling from the world. Whispers began among the other servants. They spoke of the cries that had carried down the corridor during the operation, and of the strange stillness that followed, a silence heavy as snow. Those who tended to the injured man saw the truth more plainly. The wound did not heal. It wept. The linens meant to keep it clean were stained with a thin, yellow fluid that smelled faintly rancid. And when they were changed, the man's face, blanched with pain so sharp it seemed to drive the air from his lungs. The physician visited daily at first. He would press his fingers into the flesh above the bandage, testing for warmth, asking about sensation. When the patient confessed to feeling nothing below the knee, the physician did not betray alarm. Instead, he reminded all within earshot that true cures require time, that the pathways of the body were slow to mend, and that any discomfort, however grievous, was but a prelude to restoration. His voice was steady, confident, a tone that discouraged open doubt. Yet others at court were less convinced. A rival physician, long resentful of the younger man's sudden rise in royal favor, arranged to inspect the servant under the guise of offering assistance. His examination was brisk, his expression impassive, but when he departed, a note was dispatched to a sympathetic noble warning of unorthodox methods and distressing outcomes. The court, with its appetite for intrigue, found the story. Irresistible in the sickroom reality was far less ornamental. Fever began its slow siege, beading the servant's brow with sweat even as chills racked his frame. The wound's edges darkened, the skin puckering as if trying to withdraw from the infection festering beneath. There was a sweetness in the air now, cloying and unmistakable, the smell of decay that no amount of fresh linen could mask. Flies appeared, persistent despite the shuttered windows, as though drawn by some summons, older than medicine itself. Family members, permitted brief visits, stood at the foot of the bed in uneasy silence. Some wept quietly, their grief mingled with the unspoken knowledge that they could do nothing to help. Others stared at the physician with open suspicion, unwilling to believe that such suffering could be part of any cure. Still, none dared to openly accuse him in those early days. To do so would mean challenging not only his authority, but the courtly patronage that shielded him. The physician himself began to visit less frequently, delegating the daily care to attendants who followed. His instructions without question. When summoned by urgent message, when the fever spiked, or the patient's breathing turned ragged, he would arrive with the same calm pronouncements, that the swelling must resolve before movement could return, that infection was a natural byproduct of deep healing, that any appearance of worsening was temporary. His words were precise, his tone unfaltering. In the servants' quarters, they called it something else. Not treatment, but torment. Not healing, but slow destruction. Yet even here, opinion was divided. Some pitied the servant deeply. Others, hardened by their own years of toil and injury, regarded him as a grim warning about what came of becoming the subject of a master's experiment. A few, more calculating, saw in his decline a chance to damage the physician's standing. If only the story could be carried to the right ears by the third week. The leg had begun to emit heat of its own, not the clean heat of the brazier's flame, but the suffocating warmth of rot. The skin split in places, oozing a mixture of pus and thin blood. The smell was no longer something that could be hidden. It clung to the air, to the hands of those who dressed the wound, to the very walls. The man's voice, once strong enough to shout in pain, had grown hoarse, his words slurred by exhaustion. The physician insisted on patience, reminding the court that great discoveries often came at the edge of known science. He spoke of ancient cures, of moments in history when the bravest healers endured ridicule before triumph. He warned against premature judgment and invoked the authority of his patrons to silence further gossip. But the gossip did not silence. It only deepened, retreating into corridors and whispered conversations behind closed doors in the palace above. Feasts continued, their music drifting faintly through the floorboards of the servants' chamber. Candles burned in crystal holders, wine spilled into silver cups, and laughter echoed over the tables where nobles congratulated themselves on their refinement. But below, in the dim light of the sick room, the air was thick with the scent of death, and the sound of laughter seemed to come from another world entirely. The servants' eyes had changed. Once quick to follow a speaker's words, they now moved sluggishly, as though each glance cost him something. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was often to ask for water or for the room to be quiet. His leg lay still, swaddled in evident bandages, the oil's promise long since curdled into an unspoken sentence. The physician's name was still spoken with respect in public, though in certain tones that suggested a private doubt. His theories were still defended, but cautiously, and though no one would say it aloud in the hearing of the court, there were those who began to wonder not whether his cure had failed, but whether it had ever been a cure at all. And somewhere between the polished floors of the palace and the shadowed chambers below, the truth waited, patient as a slow fever. What happens when justice wears the same robes as power? The whispers, once contained to servants' quarters and dimly lit corridors, began to climb the gilded staircase into the chambers of influence. What had begun as hushed murmurs about a servant's mysterious injury became a quiet scandal, one that reached the ears of those whose reputations could not risk the appearance of negligence. A man lay rotting in a bed within the palace walls, and though his life counted little in the eyes of most courtiers, the cause of his suffering could no longer be ignored. The inquiry was not convened in a courtroom, but in a chamber lined with tapestries and heavy drapes, where sunlight was filtered into a muted gold, lending the proceedings an air of solemnity that masked the motives beneath. The long table at the room's center was flanked by men in rich garments, their expressions grave but unreadable. They were not judges in the truest sense. They were protectors of the realm's image. The physician stood before them, his posture composed, his gaze direct. He wore the same immaculate coat in which he had attended the highest members of the royal household, a reminder of his closeness to power. His defense, from the outset, was delivered not as a plea but as a lecture. He spoke of the ancients, of Galen and Avicenna, of the belief that fire could purify, that the most grievous maladies demanded the most decisive measures. He did not speak of the smell of decay in the sick room, nor the servants' eyes clouded with fever. Those details belonged to the realm of gossip, and gossip was not welcome here. The first witnesses were attendants from the procedure itself. One spoke with trembling hands clasped tightly together, describing the physician's care, his steady hand, his certainty in the moment of decision. Another, older and with less to lose, told of the servant's agonized cries and the stench that followed, his voice carrying the weight of quiet condemnation. Each account seemed to cancel the last, leaving the room suspended between reverence and revulsion. When the rival physician was called, the air shifted. He moved with calculated slowness, his testimony measured but laced with barbs. He spoke of unproven methods and reckless innovation, of a failure to consult the broader wisdom of the medical community. Yet, when pressed, he would not declare the treatment outright malicious, only ill-advised. The choice of words mattered. Accusation was dangerous when the accused stood under the shadow of royal favor. Others came forward in defense. A lady of the court recounted how the physician had saved her son from a fever that had nearly taken him. A steward praised the doctor's dedication, claiming no man in his position would have dared attempt so bold a cure unless truly confident in its merit. Their voices carried the cadence of loyalty, whether genuine or purchased by the subtle debts of patronage. As the testimonies unfolded, It became clear the inquiry was less about determining truth than about framing a narrative palatable to those who governed. The idea that the physician might be punished for his actions was quietly unthinkable. To censure him would be to admit that the court itself had sanctioned recklessness, that the glittering image of wisdom and progress it presented to the world was tainted by ignorance and cruelty. The servant's condition was mentioned only in passing, as though he were an inconvenient detail. His absence from the chamber was justified by his fragility, though those who had seen him knew the truth, that his leg was now a site of ruin, and his strength bled away a little more each day, but no one in the inquiry spoke for him directly. He was a subject of medicine, not a citizen of the realm. The grave lies beyond the hospital walls, in what was once the pauper's burial ground. The gate has long since fallen, the stones leaning at strange angles, inscriptions worn illegible by frost and rain. Most of the plots are unmarked, swallowed entirely by wild grass and nettles. It is in this field, somewhere beneath the roots of gnarled trees, that the servant's body was lowered. No mourners were recorded, no rites beyond the bare minimum afforded by the parish. In the ledgers, his name is little more than a smudge, between other entries, a man's existence reduced to the width of a line in fading ink. The doctor's grave is not here. He rests miles away, under a more deliberate monument, though even that has lost its authority. The stone has weathered, the letters softened to the point that they are legible only in certain light. Few who pass by recognize the name, and fewer still recall the experiment that once made it notorious. What was once a subject of whispers in candlelit rooms has become a footnote in a medical archive, consulted only by scholars trawling for curiosities. Standing among the graves, the question lingers like mist above the grass, when history forgets. Our cruelty, are we absolved? Or does the forgetting simply make it easier for the cycle to begin again, stripped of the cautionary shadows of memory? The field offers no answer. The wind moves through the branches with a sound like the turning of pages, but the book it reads from is one no living person can hold. The ground here is uneven, soft in places where the earth has shifted. It is easy to imagine how, over centuries, the outlines of graves blur, how the borders between one life and another dissolve, until all are indistinguishable beneath the same thin crust of soil. This anonymity is both mercy and violence. Mercy, in that suffering is no longer bound to a name. Violence, in that the dignity of remembrance has been denied. In the village nearby, the hospital story is little more than a local rumor. An old man in the square remembers hearing from his grandmother that the place had been bad for the soul. A woman in the bakery speaks of shadows in the upper windows, though no one has lived there for decades. But the servant's name is not among these recollections, nor is the physician's. They have been reduced to archetypes. The victim and the experimenter, stripped of their human detail. As the light begins to fade, the ruined building takes on a different presence. The shadows in its hollow windows deepen. The ivy seems to shift, inching upward as if reclaiming its slow dominion over human creation. The air cools, and the damp scent of stone becomes sharper, carrying with it a trace of something older, perhaps the faint mineral memory of the hundreds who passed through these halls before death claimed them. It is tempting to leave, to step away from the weight of the place, but the stillness holds the listener fast. There is a sense that to turn away too quickly would be to abandon the dead once more, to contribute to the slow erasure that has already consumed their names. And yet, no matter how long one stands here, no truth emerges from the silence. Only witness left is the land itself, and the land has no obligation to speak. When the final glance is cast at the field, nothing marks where the servant lies. No flowers, no stones, no sign that he ever drew breath or felt the burn of oil on his skin. And perhaps that is the truest end of all cruelty, not in memory, but in the slow surrender of every trace until the past becomes unquotable, a wound without a scar. If this story disturbed you, imagine the ones we haven't told yet. Subscribe for more true stories that were buried for a reason. The physician's closing words were delivered with quiet conviction. He declared that he had acted with the highest intentions, guided by the teachings of history and the urgent need to innovate in the face of mortal affliction. He conceded that the outcome had been unfortunate, but framed it as a necessary step on the path to knowledge, a sacrifice not in vain, but in service to the greater good. When the verdict was finally read, it was as carefully crafted as the tapestries. On the walls, the physician was absolved of wrongdoing. The procedure was deemed an act of bold experimentation, undertaken in the spirit of advancing the healing arts. Recommendations were made for further study and greater caution, but no sanction followed. The court could now present itself as both enlightened and decisive, a patron of science, unafraid of failure, yet unwilling to descend into vindictive punishment. Outside the chamber, the news spread quickly. Among the nobility, it was discussed as a triumph of progress over superstition. In the servants' quarters, it was proof that the suffering of one man was worth less than the reputation of those in power. The servant himself received no visit from the men who had judged his fate, no acknowledgement of the pain that still gripped him. His life had become a footnote, an unfortunate incident folded neatly into the annals of medical history. The physician returned to his work, his position intact, though shadows now followed him. Those who once approached him with unqualified admiration now watched him with a trace of caution. He had survived the court's judgment, but the judgment of the corridors, the kitchens, and the alleyways beyond the palace gates was a different matter. In the grand hallways where justice had been rendered, the air was calm once more, but beneath the polished floors, in a bed that smelled faintly of oil and decay, the consequences of that justice lingered, a quiet reminder that in this place truth did not live in the verdict, but in the silences between testimonies. What is the sound of a reputation dying? It is not the crash of ruin, but the soft, almost polite closing of doors. The physician who had once walked the marble corridors of power with unshakable confidence now found himself navigating quieter, narrower streets of influence. The change came gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. A missed invitation to a symposium could be explained by an oversight. A reduction in private consultations could be attributed to shifting fashions in medical theory. But over time, the absences multiplied, and what had been dismissed as coincidence began to reveal its true form. Deliberate omission thought the scandal of the boiling oil had never truly disappeared. It had been polished, reframed, wrapped in the language of bold experimentation by the court. But memory does not yield so easily to official verdicts. In the drawing rooms of polite society, there remained a faint, metallic taint to his name, as though it carried the smell of something scorched. People remembered the servant's leg, the screams behind closed doors, the weeks of decline. They might never mention it aloud in his presence, but the knowledge was there. In the measured pauses and in the way conversation sometimes shifted when he entered the room. His lectures, once crowded with eager apprentices and visiting dignitaries, began to thin. In the dimly lit halls of the university, the benches at the back stood empty. Students still came, but fewer lingered afterward to seek his advice. Some watched him with a kind of furtive curiosity, as if studying not just a man but a warning. Letters from colleagues began to change in tone. Where once they had been warm, laced with invitations to collaborate or consult, they now grew formal, distant. "Regrettably, I must decline," they wrote, offering excuses about prior obligations or shifting priorities. In some, the courtesy was stripped to its bare minimum, short acknowledgments that felt more like dismissals. He kept these letters, folding them neatly and placing them in a small wooden box, as if the physical preservation of the paper might resist the erosion of his standing. And yet he remained unrepentant. In his private journals, volumes bound in leather and stacked with meticulous care in his study, he wrote with the same fervor as in his prime. His entries defended his decisions with unwavering conviction. He cited the ancients again and again, their authority forming a fortress against the accusations of the present. One day, he wrote in a firm, deliberate hand, "The principles I have applied will be understood not as cruelty, but as necessity. Those who now condemn me will find themselves, in time, my reluctant disciples." But the fortress had cracks. Though his pen declared certainty, his habits revealed unease. He reread his earlier works with a kind of hunger, searching for proof that he had once been admired without question. He lingered over his own published treatises, touching the printed words as if they might still hold the warmth of acclaim. At times, he returned to the oil experiment in obsessive detail, revising his account to strengthen the argument for its necessity, as though rewriting the past could reforge his present. The medical community, however, had moved on. New theories, new faces, and new methods rose to prominence, leaving his name tethered to an incident most wished to forget. Some rivals quietly benefited from his decline, stepping into positions he once occupied. Others, less ambitious, simply erased him from their correspondence, removing his name from the fabric of their professional lives. His isolation was not total. There were still patients, mostly those too poor or too desperate to care about reputation, who sought his attention. In these cases, he worked with the same precision, the same conviction, as if treating the royal family. Yet even here, he noticed that gratitude was often tempered by wariness, and that many never returned once their immediate ailment had passed. The decline of his career was mirrored by the physical decay of his surroundings. The once bright office. Windows grew clouded with dust, the brass instruments dulled from disuse. Books he had meant to annotate remained closed for months at a time, their pages stiff and unmarked. The great oak desk at which he had once written letters to the most distinguished men of the age now bore only the slow accumulation of ink stains and unanswered correspondence. Still, he refused to see himself as fallen. In the quiet hours of night, he imagined a future historian uncovering his work, recognizing the courage in his decisions, and restoring his name to the pantheon of medical pioneers. This fantasy sustained him, a vision of vindication beyond the reach of his detractors. Yet even this belief could not entirely silence the reality pressing in. The world around him no longer echoed with his name. It no longer looked to him for guidance or innovation. He had become a relic, preserved in the brittle pages of his own arguments, awaiting an audience that might never arrive. And so, in the winter of his career, the physician walked the streets with a measured dignity, as though nothing had changed. But behind that dignity was a hollow space, the emptiness left when applause fades and the doors closed softly, one by one, beyond the city, beyond the circle of colleagues and courtiers who had once defined his worth. A new story was already forming, one in which he was no longer a protagonist, but a shadow lingering at the edge of memory, waiting for someone to decide whether he should be remembered at all. What remains of a life when even the earth has forgotten the weight it once held? Not a stone, not a name, only a hollow in the soil, concealed beneath moss and decades of wind-blown leaves. The ruins lie far from the noise of the present world, beyond a narrow road that winds like a vein through the countryside. The old hospital is a skeleton of brick and stone, its roof caved inward as if the years had been pressing down with patient hands. Ivy climbs the walls like slow fire, curling over shattered windows. Inside, the air is thick with the damp perfume of rotting timber and the faint, metallic temps of rust. Each footstep disturbs a small storm of dust, motes drifting in pale shafts of light that fall from the broken rafters above here. In these crumbling halls, the servant took his final breaths. The room where he lay has no door now, only a jagged frame. Its floor is warped from decades of rain. In the corner, weeds push through the cracked tiles, roots winding where once there had been a bed, a basin, and a table where tinctures were mixed. The silence is so deep it seems to press against the ears, yet within it is a ghost of sound, an echo shaped more by memory than by air. It was here that infection took him, when the wound would not close and the fever could not be broken. Here that the doctor's promises dissolved into the rasp of shallow breaths. And here, too, that the thin line between healing and harm revealed itself as little more than the vanity of men who believed themselves masters over pain.